Great to be with my guest, Dave Sampson, today on the Mettle Minds Podcast. Dave was a longtime athlete himself, having played college football, where he sustained a laundry list of injuries. He was also, for many years, a head strength and conditioning coach at Roanoke College, where he also was the men's lacrosse coach. And so I'm curious to hear about how you have helped athletes support them through the injury experience as a coach, and maybe to get into some of your own injury experiences. It's a pleasure to speak with you, Dave. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
So maybe you can talk a bit more about your own playing experience. I mentioned as a college football player and some of the injuries, I guess, that you had as an athlete.
Some of the more debilitating ones, oddly enough, I broke a toe one time, which doesn't sound like any big deal, but you don't realize that if you've got a broken toe, especially the big toe, which it was, you can't do anything. Yeah. I mean, you're done. It's hard to walk. It hurts 24/7. You can't, there's really no treatment for it. You can't cast it. You can't splint it. You just have to, my solution was, I cut the toes out of all my shoes because I got tired of the toes of the shoes pressing on the broken toe. So I just cut the toes out. But I came back from that. It wasn't season ending, but that was probably one of the more painful ones. A couple shoulder separations, some finger separations. I broke some ribs one time, which you hear about college players breaking their ribs or NFL guys breaking their ribs, and you think, you're broken your ribs. Come on, you got to suck it up. Well, no, that's a tough one to suck up because it hurt when I breathed. It hurt when I coughed or sneezed. It would hurt when somebody said something funny and I'd laugh. And, you can pat it all you want. You can wear the flak jackets, the whole 9 yards, but you can have a butterfly land on that protection and it's going to hurt.
Yeah.
So that really is one of the things that, the coaches tell you, and this is a while back, it's like, Sampson, you got to suck it up. I got to have you back in there. You're going to have to grind it out and suck it up.
Yeah.
And the athletic trainers who did a great job, I'd ask them, like, what do we need to do? And they're like, we'll just get you some pads for it. And I thought that was kind of the answer. But from my perspective, it was anything but the answer because there was nothing you could do to get that from hurt. Now, on the positive side, they heal, comparatively speaking, relatively fast. It's not like a long-term injury. Does it nag you a little bit? Sure, but that's something you get over relatively fast, faster than I thought. I can tell you that.
Yeah. So do you recall, you mentioned the pain. Do you recall how you manage that pain, or when you have the coaches saying you got to just suck it up? How did you kind of work through the pain of broken ribs, because it can be quite excruciating?
Oddly enough, in college we played Saturday afternoon or Saturday night games, so my pain management for Saturday and Sunday was typically a 6-pack of Budweiser, which isn't ideal, but I did all the athletic training treatments. You go to the hot tub, you take cold baths, you take hot baths, you do the contrast treatments, but sometimes it's the cold bath was probably the most effective because it numbed things.
Yeah.
But I'm not proud of it, but at the end of the day, I'd take a 6-pack of Bud after the game and I'd feel a little bit better then.
Yeah, sure.
It's not recommended, but that was my method way back.
Yeah. And I guess, you say way back, just to give a bit of context, when were you playing college football? How many years ago?
This is in the early 80s. My last year, I graduated in 1986.
Yeah.
And I tell my kids all the time, I got 2 sons, it's the game has totally changed from when I played.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny to watch it and see the different intricacies and how things are different. And, I told my youngest a couple of weeks ago, we were watching a preseason NFL game, and I'm like, gosh, I'm not sure I can play that game.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure the sport, in terms of the technical aspects, or, some of the training, has changed. But I also wonder, do you think the mentality, I mean, maybe this is a speculative question, but do you think the mentality of suck it up has changed, or is that, do you think, still pervasive?
I think at the end of the day that I got to believe, or I feel down deep that, the kind of person that goes out there and plays football, that's more times than not, those are suck it up kind of guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they pretty much, they've played since they were young, and I got to believe they know what they signed up for, and you just got to do your best to push through the pain.
Sure.
Sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's tougher.
Yeah. So on that note, I mentioned you've been a lacrosse coach, or you coach lacrosse at Roanoke College, which is also a very physical sport. For people watching who aren't familiar, there's a lot of cross-checking or hitting, and I guess the sticks are, frequently used as a defensive tool to stop the progression of the offensive player. Maybe you can talk about, kind of as a coach, how you would work with injured athletes to kind of help them when they were maybe struggling with some of the challenges of injury.
Well, I tell you, probably the biggest injuries, or three of the biggest injuries in lacrosse, and I call that football, I call it collision sport. And lacrosse, I think with the way that they've got things now, it's definitely a contact sport, but it's certainly not as violent as your football collisions. So, that said, in lacrosse, you see knee injuries,
mm-hmm.
You see shoulder injuries from, some of the hits, because, none of the protective gear that they wear, the shoulder pads or the helmet, is really designed to run into one another.
Right.
It's just not the same technical equipment that the football players have.
Sure.
The gloves are very, very similar to hockey gloves, so they're good. You've got top-notch, forearm and elbow pads, but the shoulder pads and the helmet, which is where you can take the brunt of the contact, really isn't designed for that. So, I dealt with, some shoulder injuries, and what I probably worked most with was knee injuries, the ACL, MCL, PCL, meniscus tears, stuff like that. And maybe an occasional, we had one kid rupture his Achilles one year. And those are tough, just from not only a physical standpoint from rehabilitation, but probably more so from a mental aspect. It's tough to get over that, because, you see a kid who blows his knee out, he doesn't want to go through that pain again. The pain's horrible. The injury's horrible. The surgery is tough to get through. It's a lengthy surgery. You've got zero mobility, for the first probably 2-3 weeks. And then every time you go to increase that mobility, it's a whole new level of pain.
Yeah.
So typically by the time that I got them, they were off crutches, they were wearing braces, and they were walking. And more times than not, they could jog in a figure eight.
Yeah.
But the thing that I probably worked more on, with the exception of the strength of the muscles and the ligaments and tendons around that injury, was getting the athletes to trust that joint again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's tough, because here's a kid who is finally released to work with me, and he's out on the field, and it's anywhere from 8 to 10 months after his original injury. And the last thing he wants to do, or she wants to do, is go through that again.
Sure.
It was awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you have to, push them, but let them go at their own pace, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So regaining that trust and wanting to avoid, of course, a re-injury is front and center for many athletes. Did you notice or observe other kinds of concerns or worries as athletes would go through their recovery or their rehab?
Well, I mean, right at the forethought of their minds is, well, am I going am I going to get back to playing at the level that I played before?
Yeah.
Am I going to be a starter like in the cross? Am I going to be a starting attackman? Am I going to be a first line midi again like I was? Am I going to be a starter on defense? Can I get back in the cage and be a goalie? Because, as soon as they go down, somebody gets plugged right back in. Just like, college sports, you go down and it's next man up.
Yeah.
And it was like that here as well. So, I know mentally, especially the tough kids, they know they're going to get their spot back. But, that's a tough pill to swallow as well. Think about all the time that you're sitting on the sidelines watching a kid play your position and score the goals or play the defense that you were supposed to be there for.
Yeah, sure. So
that's tough. And, you got to do your best to keep their spirits up, because if not, I'm telling you, they can spiral right down into depression, especially if you're having a great season. A kid wants to be a part of it, and it's tough to be a part of it when you're in a cast sitting on the bench.
Yeah. So are there things that you would do, Dave, to kind of help mitigate some of the likelihood that they might experience depression, or if they were, I guess, which would be understandable and legitimate, certainly, to experience a lot of worry and negative emotions? How would you work with them as a coach, or did you see that as part of your role?
Absolutely. And I tell you, probably what helped me the most to impart this to the kids was I would tell them stories of prior athletes in their sport who had the same injury, who came back, and I would tell them right up. I said, one of two things is going to happen. You're either never going to get back on that field to the level that you were, or you're going to be better than you were before. It's going to be one of those two. You're not going to come back and you're not going to be the same. And, what I found out over the years was just that a small percentage of them, never made it back to where they were. But another percentage of them were actually better. I mean, they worked their butts off, built those muscles back up. They bought into the whole weight training system because they saw results and they saw it heal their injury. And when they got back on the field, they were better than they were before.
Mm-hmm. So
they were stronger.
Like what would you attribute the differences in terms of those two trajectories or paths, if you will, where some don't return and others do? Is it just a function of, you're kind of...
I think it's a function of mental toughness.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's kind of like and it's terrible to say, you either are mentally tough or you're not. I think you can, as a coach, you can enhance mental toughness. But if you have a kid who's not, I'm not sure that you're ever going to make him mentally tough. That's a tough one there.
So how do you do that? Like because I'm just wondering about your statement. Like, on the one hand, you're saying you either are or you're not, but then you're also indicating it's something that you can enhance or help as a coach.
I tell you, it's the kids got to believe that you absolutely care about them. And I would tell them, the minute I was recruiting them, or the minute they set foot on campus, I'd introduce myself if he was not one of my recruits. And I'd tell him, I said, hey, I'm the strength coach here. I'm also an assistant lacrosse coach. I said, the good news is I can work with you 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Yeah.
The bad news is I can work with you 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Yeah.
And I would tell them, what I'm going to ask you to do, you've never done before.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I'm going to tell you this over and over and over again, your body is capable of doing so much more than your brain is telling it can do.
Right.
And at some point during your career, I need you to buy into that. When I'm out there and I'm asking you to run sprints, or I'm asking you to do pull-ups or dips or squats or whatever it is we're doing, and I say, all right, we got 2 more of these. Then at some point you just got to say, all right, I got this. I'm good. Yeah. I'm good to go.
Yeah. And so
that's a tough mental hump to get over. It really is.
Right. Kind of getting your athletes to buy into this belief or the idea that they can exceed what they think they might be possible to do physically.
Right.
But you also mentioned, I thought the point was interesting, Dave, about the importance of athletes feeling like you care about them as a coach. And I'm wondering why that's important, or how that relates to that idea of enhancing their mental toughness.
Well, I just, if the kid doesn't think you care about him, he's not going to listen to some of the stuff you're telling him. He's not going to buy into whatever you're trying to get him or her to do. Right. And if you want to be a good coach at any level, from the minute that kid steps on your campus, or on your practice field, or when you go in their home to talk to their mom and dad. They've got to believe that you have their best interests at heart. If you tell mom and dad, your kid comes here, I promise you, if he does what I ask him to do, he'll get a degree, because that's number one.
Yeah.
And I tell the kid, if you do what I ask you to do, I'll promise to make you stronger and faster and a better player than you are right now.
Right.
That's just a given. That's going to happen.
Right.
But you have to buy into it, and you have to listen to me. There's going to be some things that you're going to question and you're not going to want to do, but I'm going to need you to go ahead and do them. And you have to do that as a coach with the understanding of, that's a very gradual process. I can't expect a kid to say, all right, I need you running 10 sprints in such and such time. But it's not going to happen. But if you gradually build him up to that, and then at points throughout his training, you tell him that, hey, you know what? 8 weeks ago, you couldn't do this. Here's what's written on my paper. Take a look at it. This is how far you've come.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when a kid sees that, the light bulb goes off. Then they become hungry to do what you're asking them to do.
Right. Would you say that kind of making the athlete aware of their progress is all the more important in the case of injury recovery?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I never do anything unless I have something written down on paper. I got to have a plan. If I'm going in, no matter what I'm doing, if I got a goal to go from point A to point B, I've got something written down as to the steps I need to take to get there.
Yeah.
If I don't, then heck, it's nothing more than a wish at that point. I hope I wish I make it. I hope I make it. That doesn't work. I try never to use hope as a tactic.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned hope, because I've been doing some reading and work on that topic. And I think often the term hope is used to imply kind of this idea of wishful thinking, right? Like I just magically hope that things are going to get better. But some researchers have defined the term a little bit more precisely and suggested that hope is having not only a clear sense of what you want to do, but also having an understanding of what are the steps needed, and having the belief in oneself that you can take the steps in order to get to the goal. So sort of this idea that, maybe contrary to conventional wisdom, that it's just pie in the sky thinking, that hope is really about having optimism because you understand these are the steps I need to take. And I have the belief in myself and the requisite motivation to take those steps. So it sounds like that's kind of what you're also kind of working to instill. You mentioned with the plan. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's a great twist on that word, and I would agree with that 100%. I think that's great. I just reemphasize that, if you show a kid his progress in black and white, it does wonders for him. Your job gets easier and easier and easier.
Right.
The more he sees his progress, and the more he buys into, hey, maybe coaching is dumb as I thought he was.
Right.
He might actually know what he's talking about here.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point too that I want to just touch on. Like, what would you say the importance is of the athletes believing in a couple of things, in your capabilities as a coach, and also whether like the athlete forming the belief that you as a coach believe in their abilities?
So I think it's vastly important. And I tell kids all the time, you know what? I'm not perfect. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to make a mistake, and I'll own it. And we'll figure out where things went wrong, and we'll fix that. But if you're never wrong, and you never admit that you've made a mistake, that athlete then all of a sudden, he's not sure whether to believe you this time or not believe you this time.
Yeah.
Because some things you've told him hadn't really panned out. Some things have. So I'm not sure you've got that kid's fullest attention or fullest level of commitment is probably a better term to say. So, I would tell them all the time, listen, I'm not flawless. I'm going to screw stuff up, but I can't promise you we're going to fix it. And we're not going to make the same mistake again.
Yeah. So part of why I asked the question is it's a topic that I'm interested in researching. So my primary role, or one of my key roles, is doing research on injury recovery. And we're kind of looking at this idea of confidence beliefs. So typically sort of this notion of like people focus on self-confidence, your belief in your own ability to accomplish a task, whether it's rehab or sport related. But then that kind of, if the focus is just on self-confidence, that can kind of miss the fact that confidence is developed through interactions with people like coaches or significant others. And
right.
So we've kind of been looking into this idea of the term that we use for one of these other components is called other efficacy, where the athlete forms judgments about their coach, for instance, like, do I think my coach is knowledgeable, and are they competent? Are they skilled as a coach? And so, at least according to the theory, if you think your coach is knowledgeable, it seems logical that that's going to enhance your own self-belief because you're working with someone who's good.
Sure.
And then that there's a sort of third component, as I mentioned. Well, do I think my coach believes in me? And, I used to compete in wrestling. I remember there were times where I had lots of injuries, 3 ACL reconstructions and shoulder. And I remember times where I kind of doubted whether I had the impression, I think that my coaches might have felt that I was sort of using injury as a way out to not compete or to not be so mentally tough. And it kind of affected my own confidence. And so, yeah, I guess we're kind of exploring those concepts and ideas in relation to injury recovery and what implications it might have. So anyway, that's a bit of a mouthful.
No, and all those are very valid points and very valid areas. And what I would add to some of those is that goes back to, does the kid think you care about it? Does he really feel that you have his best interests at heart in whatever you're asking him to do?
Yeah.
And both in rehabilitation and in coaching, I mean, like I said, I'm horrible. I'm brutal. I mean, there's no gray area with me. I'm either on you hard or I'm not. And I can tell you that every athlete I've coached, I mean, I have absolutely worn out each and every one of them for doing something they knew better than to do, whether it's on the field or off the field. But, after I finished giving them the business, I'd build them back up.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you can just beat a kid down or wear him out or undress him and just walk away, because you're leaving a kid in a very vulnerable mental state. And typically, and obviously depending upon the kid, that rarely ends well.
Yeah.
So, after I'd beat him down or whatever, more times than not, I'd put my arm around him and say, all right, if we were going to do that again, what would we do different? What would you change about the decision you made? Whether it was, like I said, on campus or off campus.
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting point you're making, because I think implicit in your comment, Dave, is this idea that, like sometimes people think, oh, like caring means to be like, oh, soft and, but it's kind of like, well, no, the fact that the only reason maybe you're giving the kids, some harsh talk or whatever is because you care about them. That also, it's not just that you're just like that sort of tough talk in and of itself is maybe incomplete in terms of the goal you're trying to achieve. It's also followed up with, hey, well, yeah, you messed up here, but what are you going to do to correct it, or how are we going to change it, or something that reinforces that it's not just about the tough love, so to speak, but also the fact that you want them to improve. That, as you said earlier, I think particularly well, like you have their best interests in mind. And I guess I often relate things to some of the research that we're doing, because that's often the world that I'm involved in at the moment. But one of my former doctoral students actually we were looking at people with Parkinson's disease.
Okay.
And we kind of, in one study, we found exactly what you're talking about, where we looked at this idea. My colleague has looked at this idea of like a caring climate, is what she calls it. And basically, it's like looks at sort of the interaction that happens in terms of motivating athletes or performers or exercisers. And part of the definition is what you describe, right? Where it's like the person, they feel like they're valued, respected, and the person has their best interests in mind. And so none of that, like one can still be, valued, respected, and have their best interests in mind, and still get, like, that doesn't always mean they're getting smoke blown out there, or
Right.
it's always positive all the time. But in one study, we found where Parkinson's patients who felt like their physiotherapists created this caring climate, feeling valued, respected, and their interests, that they also had higher confidence beliefs that I described earlier. They felt like their practitioner was more competent, and they also felt like the practitioner believed in them, and that had positive implications for their engagement in their exercise and rehab program. So I think kind of all that to say is there's some science behind what you're saying as well, I think, which is really interesting.
I'll tell you a funny story, and the only reason I'm going to tell this is because it has a happy ending. I had a kid that came to Roanoke. He was one of my recruits. He was a face-off middie, and even to this day, the kid had the quickest hands that I have ever seen. I mean, just lightning fast. But at the time, he was mentally soft and didn't like anybody hitting him or hitting him with their stick or anything like that. And I would tell him, you got to get over that. You're a face-off middie. You got to be tough. You got to take it. And, he'd get into games and he would get nervous and he'd jump early and cost us some penalties. And, it finally came down to the point where, the end of the year, I'm like, such and such, I can't play you. I can't put you in there. You're not mentally tough enough to go in there and get it. You'll win the face-off probably 80 to 90% of the time, which is first team All-American status at any level. But the minute you win it, somebody's going to take it away from you. So at that point, I don't care if you won or not. We don't have the ball. That's the idea. That's your job. It's your job. You got one job. Get us the ball. That's it. And we tried everything to get him to get rid of the ball or to get the ball to someone, but he just didn't do it. So the year ends. I know he's not happy. And, our relationship, we're fine. He comes in, sits down in my office. He's getting ready to go home. He says, Coach, I think I'm going to stay up here for summer school. Will you work with me and help me? I'm like, absolutely. I'd love to do that. Just let's call my mom and make sure this is okay. We did that. Mom buys in, he buys in. I'm like, wow, that's great. This is awesome. And I find out a week later, he transfers somewhere else. So he goes to a Division II school. And I think, well, that's not the answer, but I hope things work out. Well, the kid's a two-time All-American there. And he gets drafted and he plays in the pro league, the PLL they have now.
Yeah, wow.
And I think, well, good. And the head coach kind of kids me around. He says, "Hey, great, you ran off a potential All-American. What the heck are you doing?" I'm like, Coach, he wouldn't play for us the way he was. So then, like a month later, I get this email from him, and I'm like, oh God, here it is. Here's the big I told you I was good. You don't know what you're doing letter. But it was just the opposite. It said to the effect that, I thought my year at Roanoke was the worst year of my life, and I realized, you staying on me all the time changed who I wanted to be and changed who I ended up being, and it made me a tougher and better man. And I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah. I see this. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So I suppose that, kind of comes back to the earlier point that you had mentioned about sort of the potential value of adversity, right? And, earlier you had mentioned that in the case of injury, athletes will either maybe they're not going to come back, or they're going to come back and they're going to be better. And you talked about some of the athletes are really keen and motivated, and And they're also doing the physical things to get themselves back. So like their muscles are stronger, maybe functionally they're better. Um, are there other things in your experience, coaching or personal experience, that may enable or facilitate the likelihood that someone is able to come back and be strong to fulfill their pre-injury goals?
I not to oversimplify it, I think my battery's finally going down, but
Okay.
anyway, not to oversimplify it, I just think that down deep, the kid still has to buy in to what you're trying to do for him, or what the surgeon's trying to do for him, or what the athletic training department's trying to do for him.
Right.
If he doesn't believe in that, it's not going to work. And he's got to believe in himself as well. He's got to believe that the entire team of people around him are going to make him better than he was. And if he doesn't, then, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle, no matter what goes on outside of the weight room or training room or rehab facility or practice field, no matter what goes on, he's going to struggle. And that's tough to do, because no coach has their hands on a kid 24 hours a day.
Sure.
And it's a kid can give you all the right answers when you're talking to him, but you never know what he's doing the minute he sits down in his dorm room or apartment or house or whatever, and what other people are telling him. You got to factor all that in as well. But I guess to combat that, if he believes and he buys into you, that stuff that he hears from his friends and whatnot is going to be secondary.
Right. So would you say then, at its core, I guess, kind of this return from injury is essentially a motivational issue that,
it's a big part of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got to reinstill confidence in him that he can do, that he's going to be able to do what he once did before.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do that.
Right. And again, you mentioned things like documenting progress, the value of role models, or telling about athletes who have had similar injuries that have come back, and the power of the role model. Are there other kind of strategies or things that you do to try and build that motivation?
You watch a top-notch athletic trainer, and they're going to talk to the kid, and they're going to walk him through everything, and they're going to tell him what's going to happen before it happens.
Right.
And then as they improve, they're going to show him his improvement.
Yeah.
I always found it helpful that if I had a kid who was on the team, an older kid who had gone through the same injury that this kid was, I'd put them together and tell him, please tell Johnny what to expect.
Yeah.
Or reinforce that I told Johnny what's going to happen, and reinforce that in fact really is what's going to happen.
Right. So what would you say is the value of having the athlete know what to anticipate or expect? How does that help them with
I think it's priceless. That way there's no, I think one of the things athletes fear the most is the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
But if you lay out a good plan for them and step-by-step progress, and they know where they're going and know where they're going to be, then there's no unknown.
Yeah.
Now, they may be a little bit behind the curve, and then again, they may be a little bit ahead of the curve. Either one of those is fine, because they're still seeing progress.
Yeah. So, and that's very much, I guess, part of the athlete mindset, right? Is progress, working towards a goal. And so kind of, taking the uncertainty or the unknown, which you mentioned is aversive for the athlete, and trying to make it more known by laying out, here's the road to recovery kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. The unknown, the uncertainty, there's not an athlete out there that if he tells you he's not afraid of that, he's lying to you.
Yeah. And so in terms of, I guess, like building back the confidence, or let's say the athlete, you said, like ACL tears or MCL, PCL, like, long recoveries are common in those injuries. And if those are common injuries in lacrosse, for instance, what are some, I guess, ways that you help the athlete, maybe like once they're trying to transition back into training or competition, or they're kind of at the end of their rehab and they're trying to get back to their ultimate goal? How do you work with that athlete?
Well, I tell them probably the first and foremost thing is point out where they are right now, and then tell them, buddy, look where you were 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't run full speed. You couldn't change direction. You could barely do a figure eight. and now you're running 15-yard shuttles, and you're killing it. You're going full speed. You're planting on that joint that you were scared to plant on. You have to, I know he already knows that, or she already knows that, but the more you point things out and more you point improvements out, that confidence just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at some point he goes, all right, I'm good to go. I'm fine.
Yeah. And so I guess your suggestion there is that the kind of the mental readiness is a product of the ability to physically do certain skills that maybe they couldn't do several months ago or weeks ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of, you've also kind of talked a little bit about like treatment providers. Is it important for you as a coach to communicate with some of the other, members of the treatment team or staff, or I don't know how that would work at Roanoke College?
Well, yeah. I mean, if as a strength coach, if you don't have trust in your athletic training staff and they don't have trust in you, you're fighting an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's like a surgeon not trusting his anesthetist or not trusting his ER nurse.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, then you're trying to do somebody else's job as well as your job, because you don't know if that person knows what he's talking about or not.
Right.
And that never ends well.
Yeah.
I just want to do my job. I want to do my job better than I've ever done it before. And I want the athletic trainer to do the same thing. I already know the surgeon's done the same thing. And I was blessed at Roanoke. I mean, I couldn't ask for better staff. I knew when they handed me a kid, then he was ready for me.
Right.
They weren't handing him to me just to get him out of their hair.
Yeah. How did you know, or what builds trust, I guess, in members of your kind of staff or other maybe sport medicine providers? How do you foster that?
Oddly enough, when I ask you a question, you better know what the hell you're talking about, or tell me you don't know the answer, and you better find out right now.
Uh-huh.
And that doesn't happen overnight. Just like they don't trust me overnight.
Yeah.
They have to see how I interact with the athletes that are being rehabilitated. They have to see how I interact with the athletes out on the field that I'm training. And when they realize that I know what I'm doing and I got their best interest at heart, and I'm making them better and I'm making them stronger and I'm bringing them back to where they once were, then it's not an issue anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a two-way street.
Yeah. So just kind of over time, other people on the kind of rehab team or just other staff that you're working with, they see the work you're doing and vice versa. And
Absolutely.
That helps foster that trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In terms of, I guess, like, if the athlete is going and speaking to a medical provider, do you have thoughts on like, what are some things that athletes should be aware of or mindful in terms of their interactions with treatment providers? Or are there things that they can do to kind of make sure they get the most out of their interactions with treatment?
I would just, I tell kids all the time when they were getting ready to have surgery, you can't ask that doctor too many questions.
Right.
Because the more questions you ask him, the better you're going to feel. The more that unknown goes away.
Yeah.
Because here's a kid who, heck, what if he's never been injured before in his life? And then now he's going in tomorrow morning for ACL surgery.
Yeah.
He has no idea what's going to happen.
Right.
None. So, obviously not the next day, but I'd tell him, if you have a question, ask your doctor. Please ask the surgeon.
Do you think I do
the same with me, and the same with the training staff? You got questions about what we're doing, ask. I'll tell you why we're doing what we're doing. It's not a random selection. I'm doing this right now for a reason. So if you want to know what it is, just ask me.
Right. Do you think that the athlete, particularly you mentioned the ones that have not necessarily been injured before, do you think they know what questions to ask? Or is that something?
Maybe. And what I would do, because inevitably a kid would say, "Hey, coach, when can I be back on the field?" I said, "Ask your surgeon."
Right.
He'll give you a pretty good idea. I said, he's a doctor, and he's a damn good doctor, and he knows he's a lot smarter than I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know when you get to the point when you're given to me, you're getting closer and closer.
Right.
So questions like that, just ask your surgeon. He'll tell you.
Yeah. Well, and I guess for many athletes, that's one of the primary questions, right? Is when can I get back?
Yeah. When can I play again?
Yeah. Others may be secondary, but it's interesting too, because a number of the sport medicine providers I've been speaking to on the podcast have talked more and more about kind of moving away from time-based estimates to more functional criteria.
Absolutely.
Right. And saying, well, there's variation, because once an athlete may hear, okay, not 8 months or 9 months, like, well, that's when I'm coming back, right? And preferably 2 months earlier.
Right.
It's like, well, no, you've got to be able to meet certain criteria. And as you were saying, like, show that you can do things before you move on to the next step. That may be a week in one case. For another athlete, maybe more or less, depending on healing and things like that.
I mean, every kid is different. Every body is different. You can have a skinny kid, you can have a kind of a chubby kid, and you can have a thickly muscled kid. Yeah. And those three kids are going to rehabilitate at 3 different intervals. So I know our athletic staff at Roanoke did a great job of saying, listen, before I give you back to coach, you got to be able to do A, B, and C. Yeah. And then once they did that, they'd say, all right, you're good to go with coach. And then, obviously their question for me is, when can I play? Well, as soon as you do 1, 2, and 3, we'll get you back on the field. Right. So I was just going to ask, Dave, like, how do you kind of manage athlete expectations? Once you're maybe dealing with the injured athlete more so, maybe as they're progressing more in their recovery, and how do you manage their expectations about things like, well, getting back and playing time, or am I going to have my spot on the team, or, like all those, or more performance oriented expectations that they may have? How do you kind of work with them on that? I would always be honest and upfront with the kids. And there's basically 3 answers you give them. Hey, you're a little bit behind of where I thought you should be, but like we talked about, I got to have you be able to do A, B, and C before we put you on the field. Yeah. Or, you're ahead of schedule, which is good, but you still have to do A, B, and C before we're going to get back in there. Right. Or, your third choice is, hey, you're right on schedule. Things look great. Keep on working hard and doing what you're doing, and we'll get you back on the field. And then once you're back on the field, that's when we start working toward getting your spot back. Yeah. So I would tell coaches all the time, just be honest with the kid. Even if it's the answer he doesn't want to hear, tell him. Yeah. And, again, you don't ever want to lose that trust. You don't want him to lose that trust he has in you. No, never. Yeah. So just being upfront and clear, and again, kind of coming back to, well, it's important to be able to do certain things in order to, get back, to be cleared, or once you are to get your spot on the team, or to reach the next milestone. Absolutely. Yeah. I know we've talked, I guess, quite a bit about some of the work that you do as a coach, and at the start of our conversation about some of your own injury experience, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of your recent experience. I understand you've had some injury experience more recently. Is that correct? Yeah, I had hip replacement surgery. Yeah. Just through, there was no one event that brought that on. It's just years and years of, football, doing squats, weight training, running, taking hits. I did some MMA fighting, and, cumulatively over the last, 30 or 40 years, that joint was not in a good place. Yeah. And, I made some wrong choices to deal with the pain. I used some steroids to try to keep muscle mass on that joint, and manage the pain. And, it made it a little bit better, but it wasn't what I wanted it to be or where it should be. And, I'm not proud of that fact. Yeah. But, I finally got the nerve up to tell myself, listen, you got to do something about this. What you're doing right now, it's not working. It's illegal. And, you need to get that joint fixed. Yeah. So I did. So you were having problems with pain? Oh, it was awful. Yeah. And I thought if I built that joint up stronger, then that pain would go away because I'm taking my hip joint at that point was bone on bone. So my rationale to myself was if I build up the muscle around that joint, that'll lessen the degree of those two bone surface touching. Well, that's terrible. That's not good logic.
Yeah.
And, I think down deep, I probably knew that, but I listened to myself in hopes of it would solve my problem, and I would stay off underneath the knife.
Okay, so you were taking steroids before you got an operation, is that right? To try and
Yes.
avoid that surgery.
Yes.
And subsequently, did you end up having a hip surgery?
Yeah, I had a full hip replacement on my left hip.
Yeah. And what has that recovery been like?
It was the funniest thing I've ever experienced. I was the first one on the table on a Wednesday morning, and I remember the doctor coming in and coming to my bedside about 2 that afternoon and looking at me and going, "Coach, how you doing?" I said, "I think I'm all right." So he plops a little stationary bike up on the bed. He goes, "Well, try pedal this real quick for me." So I did that. I'm like, "Wow, I didn't have any pain." I'm like, "Well," he goes, "Is everything okay? Do you feel pain?" I'm like, "No, I don't feel anything at all." He goes, "Well, do you want to try walking?" I'm like, "Yeah." So I'm still hooked up to an IV cart, and I'm laying in my bed, and he puts a walker next to me. And I don't remember it, but my wife said I pushed the walker out of the way, grabbed the IV post, and just started walking down the hall.
Uh-huh.
And I had a really great surgeon, did an awesome job, Preston Waldrop. I can hear him. I do remember him in the hospital room laughing. And he's like, I can hear him telling my wife, it's not supposed to work like that. This is a gradual process.
Yeah.
I know your husband's a little, overzealous, so let's try to reel him back in a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess that's interesting too, about being overzealous, I guess, because, it sounds like with your athletes, you also try and rein them in, if they're getting ahead of themselves.
Yeah.
So how far into how long ago was your hip replacement?
I think I had that done in 2015, in November 2015.
Okay, so quite a number of years ago, and I wasn't quite sure if it was more recent or, but was that, based on your initial experience being able to walk, was it smooth sailing? Was it up and down recovery? How would you characterize the process?
It had some road bumps, but I had done a lot of what they call prehab work and strengthened my glutes, my hip flexors, and my quads. I'd really gone overboard strengthening them up in hopes of lessening my rehab time.
Right.
So I remember going to my first PT appointment, and their biggest struggle was teaching me how to walk correctly again.
Yeah.
Because I'd been in such pain for so many years that I had compensated and I had changed my gait to an improper walk.
Right.
So once they got that down, I was done with rehab and just kind of rehab myself. I grabbed one of the interns in the athletic training department. I'm like, "Listen, here, we're going to do this, this, and this." They'd take me in the athletic training room and I'd give another intern. I'm like, "Listen, I need to be stretched. We're going to do this, this, and this."
Right.
So, did I go overboard at first? Yeah. The first, I was back at work a week later, which was not supposed to be what was happened, but
yeah.
I went anyway. And then I started feeling this really bad pain in my hip. I'm like, "Oh God, I got staph infection or something like that. Something bad, the hip joint's failing."
Yeah.
So I go see my surgeon and he says, "Well, Coach, walk me through a typical day." And I said, "Well, I usually get there at about 5:30. I teach a boot camp class at 6. I teach another one at 7. I do my work. I go through my workout. I get my rehab. I eat lunch. I do some more work. Then I'm out on the field for practice at 3, and I'm usually home by 8.
Yeah.
He's like, a week and a half ago, you had major surgery."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Yeah, I know you." I said, "You fixed it." What? I said, "Yeah. What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, let me put it to you in another term." He goes, I've just given you a brand new Ferrari. If you take care of it and drive it responsibly, you can have that Ferrari for the rest of your life. If you drive it like you're driving it now, you're going to need a Ferrari.
Yeah.
He says, pick one or the other. He goes, either work in the morning until lunch or work from lunch in the evening. Pick one or two, whatever's most important, and wherever you are most beneficial, do that. So I did that for 3 or 4 weeks and I was fine.
Yeah. So that, would you say the analogy helped put things into a different light or perspective, I guess, in terms of,
I knew right what the hell he was talking about.
yeah.
I knew I didn't want another Ferrari.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's interesting because, sort of going back to your point about having the plan or progression, I wonder if that was articulated to you or not, because it almost sounds like it's like, well, I've been fixed. Now I can just go back out and do my thing again.
I was not following good instructions because I'd been in pain for so long and it was finally pain free that I was ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of your mindset sort of shifted from, okay, now that I'm pain free, I can just go to unrestricted activity and kind of do whatever I want, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And I look back in hindsight and it probably was, a good 6 or 8 months before that side of my body had caught up to the other side from a strength standpoint.
Right.
And, I like I said, I reeled myself back in. I started following the regimen and the program was laid out for me, and things obviously went better then since I was following instructions.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that note, maybe, I guess I'm wondering what kind of, if you were to offer advice or suggestions to an athlete or, maybe someone who's had chronic pain and going through something like a hip replacement, what would be your wisdom or suggestion to that individual?
Go get it done.
Yeah.
Go get it done. There's a young lady that works at an office near where I go, and she walks the way I used to walk. And I walked up to her one day and I said, listen, I know you don't know who I am. I'm not being rude or nosy or anything like that. I said, but I'm guessing your hip hurts. She's like, yeah, I'm just trying to put this off. And I told her a quick story. I said, honey, go get it done.
Yeah.
Because you're going to go from horrible pain to no pain in less than 24 hours. I said, it's a long road, but you're going to be pain free the next day. You really will be.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in terms of like something like a hip replacement, I know the surgical procedures have advanced significantly. And, but it also sounds like, you mentioned sort of the value of following the plan or the program as well. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would tell kids, athletes that are, injured and trying to play through their injury. I'm like, listen, I know you have an off season. Use your off season to fix your problem. Stop these Band-Aid solutions, because long term and short term, you're cheating yourself. They're not the answer.
Yeah. So I guess that would be a little bit of, well, maybe more than just a little bit. Maybe it's a 180 from the mindset that we started our discussion out, where the coach is just saying, well, just tough it out. Right. You're suggesting that can be counterproductive in both in the short and long term.
Yeah, I would never tell a kid to tough it out. And I think back to when I was in high school, where, we had an athletic trainer. He was our wrestling coach, and he's the guy that taped you up and did all that stuff and looked at you. But I can remember, having your bell rung, and you may or may not have had a concussion, but if you could tell that guy where you were and how many fingers he had up, then you were good to go back in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even if you said 3 fingers and he had 2, it's pretty close. Coach, he's all right, let him go.
Right. Well, and there's a lot more awareness these days, right, about concussion and its implications. And as you say, it's not just getting one's bell rung, but it can be serious and potentially debilitating.
Yeah, thank God those advances have been made, because I look back at some of the, things that I experienced and went through, and it seems almost barbaric to the
Yeah.
way athletes are handled today, especially given the concussion protocols that you have to go through.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, I very much appreciate, Dave, the chance to chat and hear about your personal injury experiences and your work as a coach. And yeah, it's great to speak with you. Thanks for being with me.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm sorry about the temporary interruption there at the end.
No worries. Thanks, and great to have you.